All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so sorry for the in-person folks that I'm going to stand so far away, but I want to make sure that my voice gets picked up by the laptop for the folks who are online with us. So I just want to welcome everybody to the Housing Needs Meeting for the Northwest Tennessee Development District. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to be here, both online and in person. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to share some helpful information with you all, and then um, during the Q&A and for the in-person folks during the focus groups, we really hope to hear more from you about what you noticed in the data in our presentation, as well as like what is top of mind for you all with housing on the ground. This is also a chance for us as the state agency to learn about what's going on in your communities, and hear what's going really well and where you're facing challenges. So thank you everybody for taking the time to be here today. As we get started, I want to make sure that I thank a few folks. So we have our development district leaders here. I want to thank Melinda, Wanda, and Jessica at Northwest Tennessee Development District. Y'all have been so helpful and communicative in planning this event, as well as Michael Nielsen. He is one of the events coordinators here at the Martin Event Center and helped us make sure everything was set and ready to go. So we couldn't really do any of this without you. Thank you so much. This meeting, it has kind of two purposes. One of them is related to something called consolidated planning, which I know some of you may be familiar with and some of you are maybe less so. So I want to give a very small overview about what the consolidated plan is, since this meeting is related to that. So the state of Tennessee submits an application to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development every year for about 50 to 60 million in federal funds. And these are called consolidated planning funds. Those funds are then distributed to all the different local regions through these programs that you see here. So we have the Community Development or Block Grant, the Emergency Solutions Grant, the Home Investment Partnership Program, the Housing Trust Fund, and Housing Opportunities for Persons with HIV and AIDS. So on one hand, this meeting is related to us better understanding regional housing needs to help us make program decisions for how that funding gets used. But more broadly, we want to make sure that since we're going to each locality, and because the state of Tennessee obviously intersects with a lot of different housing work, that we understand more broadly what's happening in all of the regions. So your thoughts or comments don't need to be limited to the scope of these programs. We're really hoping to hear about things holistically, but this meeting is somewhat related to us applying for and receiving those funds as well. Just a very quick note about what those funds do. So you can see HUD there is distributing the funds to the state of Tennessee, then we distribute them down to the different programs. And the CDBG program is mostly focused on infrastructure projects. These projects have to go to areas that have 51% or more households who are at that 80% area median income or less. So there's some requirements, right, for how the money gets distributed. This one is overseen by the Department of Economic and Community Development. The three in the middle are overseen by THDA. So the home program is mostly focused on single-family housing and rehabilitation projects, again, benefiting households that are at an income of 80% AMI or less. The Housing Trust Fund program is focused on multifamily development for extremely low income households. So that's at 30% AMI or less. And then ESG is focused on both services for people experiencing homelessness as well as homelessness prevention. And, there's not, generally speaking, income related things for that. But if you're struggling in that way, typically it means you just don't have a lot of resources. And then for HOPWA, this is mostly a housing subsidy that benefits low-income households where one of the household members has HIV or AIDS. So it's a pretty broad range of programs and activities that fit under this consolidated plan, and it touches on a bunch of different housing issues, but certainly isn't, completely comprehensive. So with that in mind, we talked about this a little bit at the beginning. I want to make sure that I'm like coming to you all in a spirit of humility. I have never lived in your region. I was asking for guidance about how to pronounce various places. So we want to hear from you, like, what do you notice in the data? What seems to capture your experience really well? What maybe seems off or what's missing from the data? This is all based not every data point, but a lot of this is based on the American Community Survey, which is a really well-designed survey, but is still subject to sampling error. And most of the data that I'm going to be talking about today is from 2022. So it's a couple years out of date, and things are moving quickly in this space. So just keeping that in mind. And then lastly, I'm presenting on housing needs, and the thing that's going to be completely left out of my presentation are like the community strengths. I won't be able to speak to things like having close-knit communities, a generational connection to the land or community, having a unique culture. That's where we kind of hope you all will share with us for your local area, what's been going on for you. So we're going to start out with about 45 minutes of a housing needs presentation. And then at the end, we're going to have a chance for you all to do a question and answer. So if you notice something in the data that you want to talk about further, if you want to ask me questions about, or if you want to tell me like, that doesn't seem quite right for our area, that will be a great time to do it. Most of the slides have a little number down in the corner. So if you see something and you're like, oh, I want to talk about slide number 12, just, make yourself a little mental note and we can come back to it. And then afterward, the in-person group, we're going to do some focus groups related to housing affordability and homelessness. Okay, so now it's time to just jump right into the focus for today. So when we think about housing needs, we typically break it down into a couple of components. And of course, you can see here that this is going to include the current population of the Northwest Development District, who currently lives here, and what resources they have, typically related to household income. Then we're going to take a look at, okay, what about the housing supply and the housing prices? How do those things fit with what we know about who lives here? And then we're going to consider, okay, what's happening with future populations? I'm not going to get as much into future populations. I know West Tennessee Planning is doing a lot of work about the future projections. Most of what I'm going to talk about today is some things that we're seeing within the current housing market, what we're seeing on the ground right now. And then we'll talk a little bit about what do all of those things mean for future housing supply, and if we can't build that supply, for housing stability. So we're going to start out with what the region is like right now, check in on what we know about who lives here now, what comprises the current housing supply, and how much that housing costs currently. All right, so first and foremost, I know that y'all know that Northwest Development District is obviously a mostly rural district, but everywhere you can see that there are just these pockets of towns and density in every region across the state, but that the Northwest District has a more rural character, right? And currently we have about 250,000 residents in this development district. Now, historically, at least, Northwest, Southwest, and Mid-South District have been experiencing either kind of stagnant population growth or in some cases, a little bit of a loss. You can see in Northwest and Mid-South. This is for the last 5 years. Whereas if you look at other parts of the state, they're growing extremely quickly. In the last 5 years, the greater Nashville area has had a 10.5% increase. And really, Upper Cumberland and South Central has had very fast growth as well, with East Tennessee being kind of a more moderate population growth. And if we dig in a little bit to what we're seeing in the counties, we've got some counties that are experiencing a fairly significant loss. You can see that Lake County had a 9% loss of population in the last 5 years. Whereas Obion, did I get it? Okay, Obion is at 0. It's flat. And then Gibson has a small population growth. So it kind of does, at least in the last little bit, has been a little bit disparate across the region. And I know what y'all are planning for is potentially very large influxes of people, seeing kind of those large growth numbers in the next 10 years related to the Blue Oval development. And so I want to recognize that, you know, some of what we're going to look at right here is acknowledging that there hasn't necessarily been a ton of population growth within the last 5 years, but that we know we're on the precipice of that changing quite a lot. So here's a little breakdown of the demographic differences for what you see. So for an age distribution, you can see about 24% are kids, 18% are younger adults, 38% are middle-aged adults, and then we have 19 to 20% seniors. For the race and ethnicity distribution, about 80% white, 11% Black, 3.8% Hispanic, so that includes Hispanic people of all races. They're included within the racial table. And then we have all of the other racial categories just can't be represented super well on this graph, so they're pushed together so you can see them. But this kind of gives you a picture of what the distributions are like in the district. You can also see the household income distribution, and you'll see the little arrow pointing at the 50% mark. That's a little bit more than $50,000, and that's the area median income. So I know that y'all are familiar with AMI, but that's sometimes kind of nice just to keep in mind. Like, you know, when we're talking about 30% of AMI, that's roughly $15,000. Okay, if we're talking about, wait, is that right? Yeah, that's right. So 30% of AMI, $15,000 per year is kind of that income level. And so that's kind of helpful to keep in mind for when we're talking about the area median income piece. And then finally, you can see for household tenure that most folks in the region are in single family housing, are owners, and that's 68% of people, whereas 32% are renters. And obviously some of the renters are living in a single family dwelling. But that it's important to keep in mind when we start talking about the owner group and the renter group that they aren't the same size. The owner group is almost 2 to 1, 2 people for every 2 homeowners for every 1 renter. Well, it's right here. It is pretty true for the for Northwest and Southwest. Those are very similar. In Mid-South, ownership is the lowest in Mid-South District. Only 57% of the population owns a home here. And you can see in Greater Nashville, it's also lower, it's been lower, 65%, whereas it's actually even higher in some of the regions out east. So the Upper Cumberland region is at 72% and First is at 70%. So it does vary depending on where you live. For Northwest, if we start thinking about breaking the folks down into the owner market and the renter market, you can see that renters tend to be younger, and that kind of makes sense. I mean, you have to save a while typically to be able to afford a down payment or to have the kind of credit that you might need to have a mortgage. So the owner households tend to be older. If you look at the racial breakdown, you can see that there is a difference racially between the owner and renter groups as well. So People of color are more likely to be renters than they are to be owners. I think that's just important to keep in mind when you think about what's happening in these markets. It is going to have an impact on what happens racially. And then we have our renter and owner incomes. This part, makes a lot of sense as well. In order to qualify for a mortgage, you typically have to be at a certain income threshold, et cetera. So folks who are in more the upper bands of household income, are these switched? No, they're not. Okay. Tend to have higher incomes versus the renter distribution tends to be of lower incomes. And here's finally kind of the same information related to the income distribution, but now related to AMI, so related to area median income. The ones that are below the area median income, so these groups here, tend to be renters, whereas if you are above the median income, it's much more likely that you will be an owner. All right, so keeping that in mind about who lives here, now let's go ahead and take a look at what the current housing supply looks like. And one thing we want to note before we look at the housing supply is typically we want to make sure that every community has a range of different kinds of housing. And this is because we want to provide those stepping stones that might allow people to move up in their different housing options as they go through life. And hopefully having an opportunity to build savings and build equity. But also, things happen, and we want to make sure that if people have things going on in their lives that cause them to struggle, that there are options as they maybe have to move down an income spectrum. And that, if they are in this 30% AMI group, you're fairly under-resourced. And so if you experience something tough, then we want to make sure that there are supportive housing and services. So there's really a broad spectrum of what we want to have in a community when we think about providing that housing spectrum. So when we look at the type of housing units in Northwest, sort of consistent with 68% of people being homeowners, you can see that the most common type of structure is a one unit single family detached home, 71%. It means that probably some of those are being rented. And then you kind of see a very small distribution of the different types of more multifamily kinds of homes in the middle, as well as about 15% of the structures are mobile homes. And I know I got to attend the rural land use conference that was focused on housing earlier. And one point that came up really often there was about how the financial crisis really caused a big drop in building, right? And so you can see this really clearly on this graph with the red line. This is the number of housing starts, and it's adjusted by population. So the population is still growing, but you can see that there's this huge plummet in the number of housing starts, and that we are really only kind of now starting maybe to get back to the levels that we saw before the recession, despite the fact that we have all of these people who already exist and are moving through the household formation kinds of things. And so really we know that there's a housing shortage that's happening simply because we haven't been building at the rate related to the population for the last 15 years. And so what you see then is, if you're not adding new structures, then what tends to happen is your house, the median age of your housing stock becomes older. This is especially true for the rental housing. You can see here that the median rental housing is 46, 47, even 49 years old, and that's the median. So you would expect that in those cases, there would maybe be significant challenges with preservation and upkeep, just as a function of age, not necessarily as a function of anything that anybody is actively doing poorly. But, you know, it takes a lot of work to maintain that housing. And the owner stock is newer than the rental stock, but not by too much. And so what this really is showing is that there just hasn't necessarily been a ton of building happening for the new, like that would shift that median age closer to now. You can see here that some counties that are in some of the other districts that have had more building happening have a like newer median age. And so I would love to hear from you in the focus groups what you're seeing with respect to housing preservation, because based on this, I would expect that that's something that is sometimes kind of challenging in the community, is assisting folks who, you know, want to upkeep their home with that, if that is that might be a need just based on age. Okay, so now we'll talk a little bit about housing prices. So this is the median gross rent for the area, and you can see the lightest green color over there is anywhere from 430 to 750, I think. But this graph shows both the median rent as well as what has happened to rental prices as a percent change within the last 5 years. And so you can see that in most places, rental prices have gone up, usually somewhere in the 20 to 30% range. So this is since 2017. Those prices have increased. And you see a similar but also more dramatic change in home sale prices. So you can see the median 2022 sales price for each county right there. But you can see that Gibson County, for example, their median sales price from 5 years ago is 70.3% higher. So a very significant jump in the price, sale price of homes. And even though, you know, you haven't necessarily had really quick population growth, home prices here are still continuing to rise. And our understanding of it is probably mostly related to the fact that there's a lack of supply. So there's always going to be demand for housing if we're not building enough of it. So with those things in mind, now we're going to talk a little bit about, okay, what housing is needed and how do we know that we need that housing? And then in the focus group, I would love to hear more about what the challenges are that you're having related to building housing, as well as what strategies you're using to build the housing currently. And then we'll visit housing instability at the end. So if we look here, we're going to first start with the rental market and talk about cost burden. So cost burden is when a household spends 30% or more of their incomes on housing. So keep in mind those like renters that we described in the first part. And in the Northwest District, 36% of households were cost burden, so spending roughly a third or more of their incomes on housing. And interestingly, the data shows that actually the percentage of cost burdened households in Northwest have gone down in the last 5 years. So I'd be curious to know, you know, I find that curious. I don't know that it's wrong, but that's what the data shows. So how are fewer people, like maybe has there been wage growth or something like that here that might have made it to where even though prices went up, the proportion of the income is less? That's kind of would be my working theory, is that wages grew faster than rents, but you saw rents grew at a 20% clip in some areas. So I'm just curious from you all what you might be seeing related to that. But here's the same kind of graph related to on a county basis. And so this might help us ground the conversation a little bit more. You can see there are places where it's showing that the cost burden went up marginally. And then there are some places like Obion, Crockett, Carroll, where it's saying that the cost burden, the percentage of cost burden households maybe has decreased. And then I also want to look at this severe rental cost burden, because severe rental cost burden, where a household spends more than 50% of their incomes on rent, this is a big predictor of housing instability. And it kind of just makes sense why. If you just don't have a lot of extra room in your budget, then when something happens, you really struggle with maintaining your housing. So you can see here that 16.7% of renters in Northwest are severely cost burdened. But again, the data is showing that this used to be marginally higher. And this is a percent change, so it's not a huge drop. It's like a 10% drop, which is like, not as maybe as big as it sounds initially, but it's showing a drop. And this is what that looks like on a county basis as well, that it looks like it's maybe that severe cost burden is dropping somewhat in Obion, Gibson, Weakley, Henry, Carroll, and Benton, whereas it looks like it's going up in Crockett, Dyer, and Lake. Okay. So here's where we get to the part for like, what housing do we need and how do we know? So we're going to think for a minute about the rental market. And I know this graph looks super confusing, but one of the tricky things about doing data analysis is you can only answer certain questions at specific geographies. And this is because all of the federal data, HUD is not just HUD, but also the Census Bureau is tasked with maintaining people's privacy. So if you think about it, they can't release too much information about people at too small of a level, or else you might be able to figure out who people are. So what they did to try to give us more like specific kind of data is they gave us a lot of information, but for large groups. So I'm going to present a couple of things related to the rental market that are at these PUMA levels. And so you can see for the Northwest District, it intersects with 3 different PUMAs. There's the city of Dyersburg, which with Martin, Union City, and Lake County. Then another one is the city of Jackson, MSA, with Haywood and Lauderdale. Then the city of Clarksville, city of Paris, along with Benton, Carroll, Houston, Humphreys County. And so let's take a look at the city of Dyersburg, Martin. So thinking about that kind of real Northwest region. So this is showing how many rental units are available for each income band. Like if you were to price them out and say, is it between the range that a 30% AMI household could afford versus a 30 to 50 and so on. So what this is showing is you can see here that you have 3,800 of rental units that are affordable to this lowest income group. But these are the 30% AMI households that live in them. There are other folks who are in these upper income bands that are also living in this housing. And that makes sense. I mean, people make decisions about where they want to live as a way to maximize their budget. So it's very common for people to try to find a less expensive living situation, right? That makes sense. And you can see this sorting in each of the graphs. So for the 30 to 50% AMI households, the units that are affordable to them, at least price-wise, we have roughly 5,800 of those units, but there's a variety of people who live in them. And the same thing is true for the other categories as well, with there being not very many units that are in the price range that you would be like 30% of a household income for those. Excuse me. And so one thing that this tells us is that for at least for this lowest group, okay, this lowest income group, there are more extremely low income households than there are units that exist. Okay, there's an absolute shortage in units that are affordable to this group. But because the 50% AMI household could live here or here and not be cost burdened. There's not an absolute shortage for the other groups. It's just that if somebody in those slightly higher income bands is cost burdened, it means that it's a mismatch problem, that they can't find a unit that's affordable to them because somebody else is living there, not that it doesn't exist. So this kind of gives us an understanding that we just need more of this kind of housing for the number of folks who live here, or they are going to be cost burden. There's just kind of no way around it numbers wise. Whereas the other groups, obviously we can't and wouldn't want to force people to live anywhere, but we do understand that what's happening is there's just kind of a mismatch in the income to rent ratio, not so much that the housing doesn't exist at all. And then the last thing I want to highlight before we move to homeownership as kind of a segue, okay, is you can see here that the black bands represent households that are living in these affordability categories, but that are at greater than 120% AMI. So these are the households that that are good candidates for entry into the homeownership market, typically, because if a affordable home was available for them to buy, they would have the income capacity probably to qualify for the mortgage. So a way that we can also impact the strain that we're seeing with cost burden in the rental market is also to build single family housing for the bands of people that we see that are living in rental housing who maybe want to make that transition into homeownership, but don't have an opportunity because they can't find a home at the correct price. And so I'm not going to talk in detail about the city of Jackson, Puma region, or so much about the city of Clarksville, but for both of these, I will note that the same trend for the 30% less than 30% AMI group does hold. There just aren't enough units for the number of people. They just, like, the number that exists don't match the number of households. And you can see here that we have a sorting, the same kind of sorting distribution as well. And one last thing about this. So our economist, Julia, is doing a lot of work on this right now. And so she's going to be releasing even kind of smaller cuts of this, like more localized than this, as a way to maybe provide some some guidance for folks about what's happening on an even more local level. Okay, so now let's go ahead and take a look at the owner housing. And so right here we can see the Homeowner Opportunity Index. And this is an index that tracks the percentage of homes that are sold in a calendar year that would be affordable to the median buyer. So that 100% of AMI median buyer. And what you can see is that homes are, as a good thing, are more affordable in the Northwest region than a lot of places. 75% of the homes that were sold, and remember, it doesn't mean that there were a lot of homes sold, but whatever was sold, 75% of them would have been available or would have been affordable to the median buyer. But what you can see, though, is that this is a really big change, even that 75% from 5 years ago. These are percentage points. So you can see that, for example, in Gibson County, currently 66% of the homes that were sold in 2022 would have been affordable to the median buyer, but that's a 22.5-point drop. So it used to be somewhere in kind of the 80s, almost 90% of the homes that were sold would have been affordable to the median buyer. And this, I think, just represents that big change in housing prices that we see, make it to where fewer of them would be affordable to kind of that middle income group. Okay, and so lastly then, keeping in mind, especially for the lowest income renters tend to be the most exposed to housing instability. As you all know, the homelessness services are provided at a different geography than at like the development district or county level. So you can see here that Northwest is encompassed in the Jackson and West Tennessee continuum of care region, which is a really large region. And so let's take a look at, now we're thinking about that as a region, not just Northwest. Every single year they do the point in time count, which counts the number of folks that they can find who are experiencing homelessness. This could be on the street, sleeping in a car, a residential vehicle, that kind of thing. And so you can see here that there has been, at least as far as the point in time count goes, a decrease over the last couple of years in number of homeless people. And the dashed line just represents the period during the pandemic where there was a loosening in like what the requirements are for counting. And so we're not sure how, if it was done the same way as it would normally have been done in another year. That's why it's dashed out, as it's less reliable. It's hard to tell if it's representative. But that's just something to know. And then down below, they do track some of the more vulnerable populations. Black folks tend to be overrepresented in homelessness, which I'll show in just a second. And then children are underrepresented, but obviously we take great care to try to make sure that we're trying to find housing solutions for children. So you can see here for the age distribution, on the left, this is the distribution for everybody who lives in the COC. It's like the whole population. And on the right, you can see what they're showing during the point in time count. So children and seniors were underrepresented in the point in time count compared to the general population, whereas middle age, young adults were overrepresented. And racially as well, you can see that for the entire COC district, we have 78% white, 19% Black, 2% all other races, whereas experiencing homelessness, it's 58 or 59% white, 34% Black, 8% other races. And then lastly, just something that we look at is kind of those areas of vulnerability. So this shows the cost burden, the rental cost burden again. The dark cost burden, or the darkest color, is showing where 30% or more of households are severely cost burdened. So they're spending more than 50% of their incomes on housing. And then the census tracts that are outlined in red are areas of concentrated poverty. So that means more than 40% of the residents there are below the poverty threshold. And these are just areas that we know people from a financial standpoint are vulnerable to homelessness if that's the amount that they're spending on rent while also having lower incomes. And, you know, something that like that combination is something that we think might be contributing to the disproportionate representation of people of color in the homelessness population. So what you can see is that in those regions, 56% of the heads of household are part of a minority race, whereas for the general population for the region, as we saw, it was more like 19%. Okay. And you can see here, these are showing the two concentrated areas of poverty that are in Obion and Weakley County, but you see something similar since it's in the COC, the continuum of care in Madison County near Jackson. There are several census tracts that are similar to that. So that's what I have for right now, as far as what we've been noticing in the data. And now I really want to hear from you all and what questions you have or comments. Like I said, this may or may not completely or even accurately to some degree represent what's happening. It's just the best data that we have for large populations. And so I'm going to open it up to you. And then the folks who are online, if you have questions, Sam is monitoring the chat in the back, and she's going to ask those on your behalf so that we can all participate together. Mm-hmm.
Seems like
Mm-hmm.
currently, based on current inventory, those things are updated a little bit closer than ACS. Is there any way to factor that into the statistics? And will ACS use that in future iterations?
So for the second question, Justin was asking about the median housing prices and realty data. So we haven't analyzed it. I do agree that the realtors are going to have much more current and complete data probably about what's going on in a region. We just don't necessarily, except for like the reports that they put out, we don't have access to like the granular version of that data. But we might be able to get it, but I don't know that we've ever tried. But I know that the ACS data is a different collection methodology. I don't think that they maybe compare what they get to other data sets. I don't know, but what they're going to report is going to be what they collect in their own survey, I think. Yeah. And that's the thing, is it is subject to a method, like, margins of error, especially in places where there's like smaller populations, which would be true for some places in Northwest. It is more subject to sampling error. So I think that especially if you're getting data from the realtors and it looks different than this, then I think it would be more current and maybe more complete if. Mm-hmm. Right.
We saw a rise, till about 2022, and then it's kind of stagnant. It's come down a little bit in pricing.
Mm-hmm.
With, I guess, that curbing inflation helped with that a little bit.
Right. Slowed the market and yeah.
So anyway, it's harder for me to get now because I used to have a realtor that would give me anything, and but I can price it. It just takes a little more finagling.
Yeah, and I think, for leaders who are wanting to think in even more detail about what's going on in their local communities, that like talking to the local realtors is a really good way to get a better, more granular and probably more accurate picture of what's going on. From our standpoint, that the good thing for us is because the same methodology is of course used across the state and across the nation, we can see trends that are happening and compare regions with each other more easily using the ACS data, which is why we do it. But I agree that like when you're a local decision maker, the closer to home you can get your data, especially as a point of comparison, is really, really helpful. We just haven't looked at it. Mm-hmm.
This has increased. Also, you should look at the homeless count of the schools. Their homeless definition is broader than what HUD allows us to count.
Yes. You said that was from Rosie?
Rose,
Roseanne, yeah, thank you for noting that. We do look at the ones related to the schools and who's doubled up based on address, like the estimates for that. We didn't include it here for the sake of time, but you are right that that is definitely not captured in a point in time count. A point in time count is also just always going to be an undercount. You're never going to find everybody who's experiencing homelessness. And especially that's true if they are in like situations like she's describing where they're moving in with friends or relatives in kind of very temporary sorts of situations. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Thank you for noting that. I agree that that's like important to keep in mind, that just because we're seeing a decrease in what we're counting doesn't necessarily mean that the problem is decreasing. It could be just like being pent up, but in other ways. Yes.
Well, Milan, Tennessee, we actually had a meeting about this morning.
Mhm.
We're seeing more.
Okay, currently, like right now. Okay. More than you've ever had. Okay.
Just
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
going to the library and clean up every day and stay in the library because it's a public space. It's heated and cool.
Right. It's more comfortable and safe in the heat. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah. So,
Okay. What other communities would, like, even just like a show of hands, who would say that within like the last year you've seen an increase, if you have any context for that? Yeah. It's growing.
I would say, Henry County
Mm-hmm.
and they are probably the most the highest.
Henry and Lake. Okay. That's
And
helpful to
Obion.
know. And Obion as well.
And
Okay.
there might be at
Okay. Just something you heard.
Yeah.
Okay.
the Eastgate Apartments there
Okay.
because they didn't have.
And is this one of the public housing authorities? Okay. Eastgate, you said? Okay. Well, we are involved with overseeing them to some degree. I know they're related to HUD, but we do some of the inspecting piece. So I'll flag that for us. I'm sure somebody at THDA knows that, but that's the first time I've heard of it. Okay. Great. Thank you for sharing. Okay. Well, yes, I was a housing case manager for youth experiencing homelessness when I lived in another state, and I know that people have been anticipating that probably homelessness will rise, mostly related to the idea of prices. Obviously, for any individual person, the reason they're homeless is often specific and complicated. But when you look at the general trends, rising prices tends to be something that across the board is going to increase homelessness. So that's just a concern, which is why we flagged it here. Mm-hmm.
Median in, or your, more than mine, but the average rent price that you have, I think they're charging about 14.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's expensive.
It's kind of.
Yeah.
Even with new paint, appliances, carpet, or whatever it is,
Mm-hmm.
it's just unheard of, but it's happening.
Yeah, well, and that's why, I know y'all are focused on the idea of housing supply, because that is what will happen if you have more people wanting a place than units available, is it will go to the person who can pay the higher rent, and people will flip them to make them more appealing for that too. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We do want there to be housing being rehabbed and maintained and those places to exist within the community. But then we need to think about how are we increasing the supply to accommodate all of the different income levels for folks that live here. Yeah. Okay.
Further. Large amount of single family and mobile homes are substandard and not meant for human habitation. And families are having to live in them because they cannot.
Okay.
And I can say with our, like, so we get ESG funds.
Hmm.
There are a lot of times, there's a lot of red tape for the ESG funds too. Like, that it has to be a certain amount of rent in that area that they can, that won't go, just say, for example, like, rent, I think we were looking at somewhere in Martin for a 1 bedroom, and then when we did the paperwork to it, with the utilities included, the person can only find something for rent for like $450.
Mhm.
You're not gonna find nothing for $450. Then the inspection part sometimes is an issue too,
Mhm.
because the landlord, they really didn't keep up their property, and that might be in the AMI,
It might be affordable and allowed to be rented. Hmm.
but,
Yeah.
and so,
Hmm.
I mean, it's already hard enough to try to find a unit to rent from a landlord, that the person could afford. But now with everything going up, can't find it.
Yeah, I know that, so, HUD sets the affordability standards that make up the ESG like guidelines. And they're aware that because their analysis lags by several years, especially in a market that's changing as quickly as this one, that people are struggling even more than usual to find places. And then, yeah, you're right. Like, the HUD wants to make sure that we're not housing people in substandard housing, but then if that's at the right price point, you couldn't house them there because maybe somebody hasn't met the inspection standards. So yeah, that I could see how that would be happening more often. Mhm. Okay. Um, other thoughts from other folks in the room or questions?
Of our community now because those folks that own those properties decided not to rebuild. So, and probably because they couldn't rebuild and rent out at the same, level that they were renting. So the disaster has made a big impact on, I know at least 3 of our counties in
Okay.
Tennessee, if not all 5, that were declared disasters during that time.
Could you just say what they are so that we could write them down?
Yes, so we had 5 that were declared over a longer period of time, but for sure it was Weekly, Gibson. I'm thinking about them as I do it, Lake County. Mine was, because that was Kenton was in Obion. And where? Sandberg Lake, so Lake and Obion both, but where's the other county? 'Cause we had 5. It wasn't, well, Gibson may have been because of that piece of Gibson and Obion are right there together. It was one of Gibson. That's on the Gibson campus.
And for folks online, Melinda is noting that they had a decrease in rental housing when a tornado destroyed some of the current stock and that wasn't rebuilt. She was listing the locations that were affected by tornadoes. Well, I think this would be a good spot to hit pause on the presentation and question and answer part of things. And for the in-person group, we'll form into our focus group. For the folks who are online, thank you so much for joining us and for your questions and comments. We will be putting this slide deck up on our website, and I'll email it to like the link to all the participants who RSVP'd either online or in person so that y'all can reference it if you would like. And we just really appreciate you taking the time to be with us and also share what you're seeing and how it compares to what we're seeing. And I hope everybody has a great afternoon. Thanks, y'all.